Okay, welcome back. Oh, I forgot to post the link. Hold up, let me do that. For those of you who rely on that link to find me. That is my bad. So I'll give those folks a minute to get in. Those link-needing people who haven't liked, commented, and subscribed. Come on, you should know how YouTube works by now. Like, comment, subscribe, share, view over and over again. The first 10 minutes of this video will be previously on. Then a word from our sponsors, and then something else. I don't know. That's YouTube in a nutshell. Okay. So, if you don't have the PHP scripts at this point, you should go back to the previous video, get the Zippy share link. Oh yeah, ring the bell. That's a good one. Yeah, don't forget to ring the bell. And then something whining about how notifications don't work anymore, and boo-hoo, we don't make any money on advertising. Something about that too. Don't build your business model on YouTube, and you will never have to worry about the fact that YouTube is not particularly profitable. Alright, so if you don't have the PHP scripts folder, then go on the last video and grab it. The Zippy share link should still be up. Let me know in chat if you are unable to access that Zippy share link anymore, if it went down. Actually, I'd probably find it in history here. Yeah, let's see. PHP scripts.zip. Look at that. It still exists. And just a friendly reminder to get adblock on Zippy share. When people say that only a small fraction of their users interact and they suspect that it's because YouTube is somehow screwing them over, the reality is that most of those people are what? What are most of the people who watch any given video, especially one that is popular? They are bots. If you guessed bots, you got it. Most of the people watching any video are probably bots because, I don't know, somehow that's just a profitable thing. But even with my videos, which have an embarrassingly small number of views, right? Sometimes I don't even get a view for every person in the class, which is very suspicious. Who's skipping class? But when I do, I also get at least a couple of other views, and I get just random, obviously bot-generated comments, like links to dating sites and hearts and things like that. So of course, I guess in order to make their spam look more legitimate or something, there is still a large number of bots on YouTube. When we left off, we were about to integrate PHP into our big old thing, and then we were going to figure out how do we actually use this to connect to our code in Java, because we don't know anything about PHP, and I, again, am kind of a novice in PHP as well, so don't expect a ton out of me here. These are old, simple, and reliable scripts. So first I'm going to pop into PHP myadmin and make sure everything is hunky-dory. This is the wrong tab. It's a regular PHP myadmin. Make sure everything's hunky-dory. Now you'll notice we're signing in as root. Ideally you want to make another user, sign in as that, give that to your scripts as well, but we're going to just use root here. Just realize that's probably not the best practice. Again, it's not particularly terrible because it's relatively hard to leak your root password to internet users, but in this case I'm leaking it because I actually gave it to you, so you guys could obviously go in here and mess with the database all you wish, because I gave you the root password to mine too, which is fine because there's really nothing on here. Alright, make sure you have color grid as one of your thingies there, one of the things on the left hand side of this, the basis of your trees, I guess we'll call it. It's a database if you want to be more specific, so make sure color grid is on your databases. I named everything all lowercase, and then make sure that you have made a structure, so you would have either hit that new sign or it would have asked you to make a structure. Make sure you made one called login info, and then let's look at the structure of login info quickly here. We're going to see it's I have 4 columns. I have user ID, password, last login, and table ID. The first 3 columns are all text in UTF-8 general CI collation. They are able to be null, so I check the box that says yes. and everything else is default. The last row is an integer. It is not able to be null, so I left that box as a no. And I set it to auto increment and primary. So I checked the box that says AI when I had the option to make the table, and I set it to primary. And this makes that field act as the row number. And so if we go back to my table, you'll see that I've got a couple entries here already. I added them earlier. There's no way to manually add entries that I know of. Well, there is actually, but it's a little convoluted, so most people don't do it. But you've got two entries here. I've got the user fish. I added him twice on different occasions. And you'll see the table ID is 3 and then 4. So what actually happened was I added fish earlier, or I added other users earlier, and those were the first couple of rows. And then I went ahead and deleted them. And as if you add more people, they'll come in as 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. So this actually lets you see which rows have been deleted, and it gives you a unique identifier for every single row. It will never repeat the table ID until you run out of space. So it's very nice to have that unique identifier for every row. It's a good way to get all of the users or something like that, which we're going to do in a bit. Okay, the other thing I want to note is that at this point you can actually connect to the PHP myadmin on your workspaces from your home computer and administer it. This is why I am a big fan of that form of administration for your MySQL database, because you don't have to actually remote into your server, which is obviously very helpful when your server doesn't have a graphical user interface. So many don't. Many web servers are going to be just box running Linux with no graphical interface, no screen. You can SSH into it, and then you can get something like X or something in order to view it like that. But if you want to just have a graphical interface only for your MySQL database, PHP admin lets you do that by just giving you a web version of it. So very helpful for that. So if you want to administer it from your home computer, you can. We're actually almost done with everything that works on the workspace, and from this point forward you're probably going to be able to do almost everything on your home computer. Alright, so let's check out these PHP scripts and see what they do. This is not a great lesson in PHP. These are probably not best practices, but you should know, even as strictly a Java application programmer, I think you should know at least a tiny bit of PHP, just enough to get by. That's pretty much all I try to learn too. PHP and Java are not that dissimilar. The syntax is a little bit different, but they are pretty similar in terms of how all the different structures are typed and things, in terms of how they work under the hood, and in terms of like object-orientedness and all of that stuff. They are real different, but in terms of just how they look, they're pretty similar. You've got your semicolons to terminate statements. You've got your parentheses to open functions. You've got your string literals in quotes. The only thing that you don't have, the only thing that's different, is that PHP will use $ to signify variable names. So if it does not have a $, then it's not a variable name. So that is a very helpful thing, a very helpful standard in PHP to see if something is a variable quickly. I guess it would be a little bit annoying in Java, but that's why you see those $ there. So every PHP script begins a little bit like HTML, which I'm sure all of you are used to, with the introductory statement that it's PHP and then a closing statement that it's over. So it's always got one of these alligator brackets with question PHP and then a question with the opposite alligator bracket to close it. So what's in there is going to be the script. Very similar to in Java, you've got the class opening and closing statements. You got the same thing in PHP. We don't have any imports here or anything, and we're not going to worry about anything like that too. We're not going that complicated at all. Okay, the first thing that we're looking at is the database name. I call the DB name. That's going to correspond to what you called the database in your PHP myadmin here. So whatever you called the upper level of the database on the left side, the top of that hierarchy, you're going to have to reproduce that here exactly. So mine's color grid in all lowercase. Don't forget to put it in quotes. And again, we're just going to sign in as root. So you see I've given you my root password here. I don't care. Don't hack me, bro, please. Don't hack my PHP myadmin. You're going to have to replace this with whatever your root password was to your MySQL database that you set up earlier. So if you have already forgotten it, hopefully it's saved in your Chrome. It's only been a week though, so hopefully you remember it. Alright, so you've got your password there. For the server name, we're going to say localhost or 127.0.0.1. I prefer localhost since it's more straightforward to say that we are being hosted on this machine. This script, the connection script, must always be hosted on the server, and we must make it impossible for the user to access it. The user will be able to use other scripts that depend on it, and the user is going to be able to run those scripts, but they will never access this script. They'll never even be able to see it, which means that your MySQL database password gets to stay private. So if users connect to your website, they are not going to be able to read this script. Whereas with other solutions that talk to MySQL databases, there's always a little bit more of a challenge in trying to keep the password to the database private. All right. Next, we've got the con variable. This is going to be the actual connection to the database. Here, we're initiating a MySQL connection. We're specifying those variables that we set earlier, the localhost, your username and password for the SQL database, and then we're actually making a connection to the database that we're going to be editing. So we're going to be looking at tables inside of that color grid database, so you have to actually connect to that one. So this connects to the MySQL database in general, and then to the database where we're going to be doing everything. And then if the connection is successful, so this is the equivalent of if connection is not equal to null, basically, or if the connection doesn't return an error. Basically, if this statement fails, then connection will remain the PHP equivalent of null. So if that doesn't happen, then we're going to print connection established. Otherwise, we're going to print connection failed, and the print statement in PHP is going to be echo. Where is that going to echo? Let's find out. So what we're going to do with this script is we're going to go to our www.root folder. I went ahead and made a subfolder called PHP where I'm going to put all of my PHP scripts. So you should probably do the same. Makes it easier to keep track of them so you don't just have everything dumped, but you don't necessarily have to if you don't want to. So I recommend making a folder called PHP to keep them all in. So right-click, new folder. It's going to ask you for admin, and then call it PHP, and you're good to go. Alright, you might have noticed at this point that you can't edit files inside of www.root. So let's say I wanted to edit index.html. I want to put some exclamation marks on this as a web page. If I go to save it, it's going to ask me where, because it doesn't like that I'm trying to save it to www.root. And if I try to save it here, it's going to be like access denied, because it doesn't like you doing that. So what you want to do if you want to edit any of these scripts is you're going to copy them to the desktop, edit them, and then move them back. Or you can change your permissions, but I always find it easier to simply copy the file to the desktop, edit it, and then move it back. Obviously, at a certain point, just fixing your permissions and everything is probably easier, but I actually like being restricted from editing there because it stops me from making some critical mistakes. If I'm in the www.root folder, I know I'm going to get that warning, so I can't accidentally edit anything that's about to go live to the internet without explicitly dragging it in there and getting the visceral feel of, I know I'm putting this on my publicly exposed internet server. So I like to keep that, even though it's a little bit inconvenient. It lets me know that I'm doing something, that has the potential to be online. Okay, so I've already dragged all of my scripts in there. If you've dragged it in there and you've set it up correctly, what you can do now is navigate to your website, your IP address. So mine is this guy here. You could also connect to mine, actually, because mine's up. And then I'm going to navigate to the PHP folder, and I'm going to go to con.php. So I've put my IP address, I've gone to the PHP directory, and I've put con.php, and this is how I'm going to test the script. So we see that echo statement here. I got connection established, which means that it was successful. Oh boy, no threats on my PC. Thanks, Amazon. And that means that it's working correctly. If you didn't get connection established, make sure your password is correct, make sure your database name is correct, make sure that the server is localhost, check for typos. I always edit these PHP scripts in Notepad, but obviously there's better software out there, so if you'd like, grab something that's, oh, please go away, I meant to hit the X. Obviously, if you'd like, please grab something better, Notepad++ or whatever most PHP programmers use. All right, let's see if everybody got to this point. So I'm going to put a survey. It should be got to, but okay, go to. Looks like the bulk of these are yeses so far. Again, if you're getting connection fail, verify that you have changed the password to your password for the MySQL database. If you've forgotten it, hopefully you can still dig it up in Chrome. And make sure that the database name matches what you named it. I named mine color grid, all lowercase. Hopefully you named it the same. Username should be root. Server name should be localhost. All the other scripts depend on this guy, so hopefully you got that working. Oh. Make sure you use your IP. Are you talking about in the URL up here? Talking about that? Let's see. Does it like that? It's fine with it, so you could use it up there. It might not be fine with it in replacement for localhost without some formatting. I think it might not like it directly. But it should. It should accept it. So I got both working there, the 127001 and localhost. Oh, you can also actually type in your bar localhost as well. You can also do that. So all three of those work. I'll stick with localhost for now, so I don't have my IP there all the time. Alright, well, people are looking at that. Let's look at the first of the three useful scripts. The most useful of all is going to be to push items into our table. So the ability to add entries to our table is obviously very important. Checking saved passwords in Chrome. I don't remember if I've signed anything important here, so I'm not going to go through the whole process, but it's going to be under settings, passwords, I think. There you go, if you want to look at your old passwords saved in Chrome. It's definitely under settings somewhere there, if that's not where it's at. And it'll ask you to type in your system password for the VM there, so hopefully you remember that too, otherwise you'll have to do it on your machine. Alright, so moving on to the push script, the first thing you're going to notice is that for all of the other scripts that we write, we're going to require con.php. That means we're going to require that a connection was established to the database to continue. It's, how can I liken it to Java? It's like an object reference, I guess. Like if connection was a class, we made an instance of it, basically. That instance would be up here. That's probably the closest equivalent. If I'm wrong, I'm not that wrong, so that's probably the closest equivalent. And now these variables look a little bit different. So we see that they're still variables. They've got that $sign, and then we see this syntax here, the $_ post syntax. So these are variables that we are going to get in as arguments when this script is connected to. So this is how PHP typically gets its arguments. Instead of getting them from the command line like most Java apps, PHP has to get the arguments from the URL. That's the only way that you connect to these. So we see that we connected to this just by typing it in the URL bar. If you had a more complicated message, you would end up with something like this. There would be like a question mark or something, and you've probably seen this a lot on your browser. It would be a question mark or something, there would be a field, it would say equals, and then it would say user, and then there would be another thing, and it would be like password, and it would say equals, and it would be your password, and so forth. This would be a HTTP GET, basically, or a PHP GET message when you see it in the URL bar like that. The difference between a GET and a POST, which is what we're using here, is that POST just doesn't show up in the URL bar. So it gives you a tiny bit more privacy. It's really not much more privacy because you could easily just snoop it in Wireshark, but it is a tiny bit more privacy. So we'll start with that. So I like to use POST whenever I'm sending data like the user's username and password, and really anything. There's not much reason to use GET unless for some reason you want to show the user information in their URL bar, which most users probably don't care for. But it's not it's not particularly adding anything security-wise. You can still snoop it in Wireshark, and there's plenty of ways to read the post. So it's not a huge benefit or anything. It just hides it in the URL bar, which aesthetically is better as well in some cases. But many websites you'll see when you sign in, you'll have the script name and then a bunch of stuff after it. That's information that's being sent in the HTTP request. So these three variables are going to come in the HTTP request, and these with single quotes are going to be the names that it's expecting those variables to come under. So when we write the code to connect to this later, we're going to have to remember these three names, which I corresponded with the name of the variable just to make it more convenient for me. But these are basically string literals. These are the names of the three pieces of information that it's expecting in the URI, in the URL. And if it doesn't get them, it's just going to assume that that variable is null. So if it doesn't get them, it's not going to crash. It's going to assume it's null. So we're going to echo adding to table here, and then we're going to echo inserted successfully at the end if this finishes. This or die MySQL error and kill the connection, a message here will terminate the script, so we will not reach the echo inserted successfully statement if this query doesn't execute successfully. So SQL is a terrible language with terrible nomenclature. Insertion also is a query. Everything in SQL is a query. We're not going to get into it. It doesn't really matter. We use our existing connection to the database. This line here in the quotes, so everything up to there is a single statement in SQL. Insert into is the command to insert a line into a database. We're inserting into a database with a particular name. Now, I should have made this a variable, but I didn't, and that's okay because I only have one table anyway, but I really should have made that a variable. That's my bad. We are going to go to our PHP and see that that lines up with the name of this table. So that's that table that you made, the structure. I named it login info, so we're not looking at color grid. That's the database name. We've already connected to that in con.php. Now we want the name of the table, which is login info. And we are going to insert those three items that we just got, the user ID, the password, and the last login. Now these, again, are the names of those columns in the login info structure. So notice they don't have $signs, so they're not variables. Maybe I should have named these different things because the confusion is a little bit real for me too here. But those are the names of the columns. So this is the name of the table. This is the name of the three columns we're going to be inserting in. And then values. Values we're going to be inserting. And we're inserting the user ID, which we extracted from that post message, the password, which we extracted from that post message, and the last login, which we extracted from that post message. And if there was a mistake, it's going to die, MySQL error con. So, like I said, if they're blank, it's going to just insert nothing. So let's see what happens when we try to insert nothing. So instead of connecting to con.php, I'm going to, remember I already dragged all these into the PHP folder, so if you haven't, you'll have to move this one as well. I'm going to run push login.php with no arguments. Let's see what happens. So it still prints connection established because it requires con.php, so that script actually executes first, and that's always going to execute first on our different PHP requests. If you don't want it to echo that, you can get rid of it in the con.php. There will be times later where it's going to be easier if we don't have it echo that. And then it says adding to table, and then it says inserted successfully. All right, so it worked. So let's see what it inserted. I'm going to refresh this page where I have my login info table open, and let's see what I have. I have another entry, and everything is blank except for the table ID, which you'll remember always increments by 1. So I have successfully inserted another entry into my table here. Let's see if I can play with it. Let me try to send something in the URL. So let's say I send like user ID equals cake. Let's see if anything happens when I do that. Is it going to add an entry with the user ID equal to cake? No, it's not. It's going to add another blank one because this is a post, not a get. Can't put stuff in the URL bar. It doesn't matter. So all that stuff, not going to happen. We're going to figure out how to actually insert data by crafting the URL on the send again later. So keep this in mind. You can also test this using a application that allows you to craft your own post messages, like Postmate, which is an extension for Chrome. So let me just plug that. Not Postmates, which is a food delivery service. Postmate. Oh, it's still giving me the food service, isn't it? Maybe if I say Postmate. Is it Postman? I'm remembering it incorrectly. Yes, I am. What is that? What is that thing called? Postman. It's Postman. Now I feel silly. There's a Postman native now. Okay, so I'm so outdated that the extension doesn't even work anymore. Alright, then download the Postman native application if you want to be able to craft your own post messages for testing purposes. But we're not going to need that. We'll do it later in Java. Okay, so that's it for push, which just adds a row to the table. Now, this doesn't check if that user already exists or anything like that. So, if I add fish again, he's just going to pop up in the table again. Now, I don't want to have any blank rows in my table, so I'm going to go ahead and delete these out of my table in phpMyAdmin. So I'm just going to hit delete, and it's going to say it was deleted. Then I'm going to go back to the table and delete that one. Alright, so now I'm back to just having my fish a couple times. Cool. Alright, on to fetch. So fetch is also going to take some data. Now fetch is intended to retrieve information for us, and when we want to retrieve information, we're probably going to supply a key. And in a database like this, where we're holding a username and a password and some data, the key is probably going to be the username. We're probably going to be asking for a user's password or a user's login information. So I'm taking 3 pieces of data here. I'm taking the user ID, I'm taking a data1 and a data2 field in the fetch script. So I'm going to take the user ID, and then I'm going to return the information contained in 2 columns for that user, and I'm going to have the sending end tell me which columns that it wants. So the data1 and data2 are going to be the names of the columns of information that you like. And I named them this instead of column because I've used this for different things before, but really these should probably be like column 1 and column 2. Again, not a PHP expert. Alright, so user ID is user ID, data1 and data2 are the column names, and then our query is going to be, again, this is SQL in the quotations here. Select from star is the wild star character, which means look through the whole thing here. Select star, the whole row, from login info, which is, again, the name of the table, the structure. Select star from login info where user ID, like is basically the double equals comparator for SQL. So select star from login info where user ID like, and then we're going to supply that user ID variable, which again we got in the post message. So it's going to find the row where find the row in login info where the user ID matches the supplied user ID, and then we're going to get that row in the result here. Okay, so we're making the query and restoring it in result. And again, we depend on our connection to the database as with all the others. All right, so if the number of rows that matched that query is greater than 0, then we're going to move on. If not, the number of rows that match that query is greater than 0. So basically, there was no such user in the database. Then we're going to exit, and we're going to return this error message, so no such entry in database. But if we were successful, then we get the row. So again, we're going to fetch it as an array of columns, basically, and we are going to return for the user the 2 pieces of data that they asked for. So we're going to echo their user ID back to them, and then the information in those 2 columns that we asked for. So you'll see that row is an array here, and this should be a familiar syntax to you. Row, the index of data 1, and then row, the index of data 2. So we're going to get the data from those two columns, where instead of index, basically a column name, but you get the general idea. Now this is very closely related to the check user script, which does almost the same thing. In this case, we take only a user ID, and once again, we do the same query, exactly the same query. We're going to try to find all of the rows with that user ID in login info. We're going to store that in a result, and this time, all we want to do is, if there was no such user, we're going to exit and say does not exist. Otherwise, we're going to print found. So this recycles all of that same code, and just rather than returning information for you, tells you if the user exists or not. This is going to be useful for us to make sure that there are no duplicate users. Okay, so that is it for the PHP scripts. Hopefully you have all of those in your www root folder. And now we're going to go on to Eclipse for the rest of it. And where should we run this Eclipse? Well, the nice thing about having your database operate like this over HTTP is that you can run your test environment anywhere. You can restrict it later on so that clients maybe can't connect to it if that's something you want to do. But if you want clients to connect to it, that's even better, because clients can connect to it from anywhere too, because it's over HTTP. Everybody's got that available pretty much. As long as they can use the internet, they can access your web page. So this is one of the most accessible platforms in terms of where you can use it. So I've used this in mobile development, in game development, in any kind of environment. As long as you can connect to the internet, you can use this approach to do your databasing. So I'm going to work on it from my home machine here. I've already uploaded this as, I think, Homework 9 Starter, if I remember correctly. So it should be under the Homework Solutions tab in Canvas, Homework 9 Starter. But we're going to go over it for a bit here. So again, I'm back on my home machine. I'm not over in Workspaces land. I'm back on my original computer. I'm going to bigify my screen here. Alright. Let me know if anyone's got trouble seeing that. And I'm going to confirm that that's still the IP address on the workspace. I believe it is, but just to be 100% sure here, 173.123.67. Okay, good. It should be static, and if not, I'm sure you'll keep it at least for the rest of the week. When you submit the homework, just as a reminder, I might ask you to restart your workspace. The SQL server and everything start up when the workspace does, and if you sign off or exit your workspace, they'll keep running for a while, but I think eventually they'll time out, so I might ask you to restart it. Ideally, I will probably grade all of you right after class one of these days when all your workspaces are still running. Okay, so I hard-coded the PHP root directory. This is where your PHP scripts are located inside of the www root folder. So I've got my IP address. Don't forget the HTTP to designate that this is an HTTP request. And don't forget to put that directory name if you did it, if you made a special folder for all your scripts. Now we're going to, if we have a chance, try to set up a DNS for our website so that we don't have to memorize an IP address. We can type the name of our website instead. This makes it even more accessible and more usable from every application. If we don't have that, then we have to pay extra for a static IP. Service providers and hosters alike will charge you a pretty considerable premium for a static IP address. Not too much, but you know, something like 10-20 bucks a month usually to have a static IP address. And then you can only have one server. There's lots of limitations there. So typically speaking, if you're going to deploy this for any kind of use, you're going to buy yourself a DNS. I am trying to find a free one that we can test that isn't completely awful. That's been a bit of a challenge. Typically, they are very, very cheap. Like a domain name that nobody really wants, a long one or some random characters, is very, very cheap. but still not quite free, and I'm going for free here since we only have a week of class left. So if you've already done this before, if you have a free DNS provider you think isn't terrible, let me know in either chat, and I'm going to give it a shot. Just want a free DNS provider that's not completely awful. Okay, so I've used an enum here. If you haven't been introduced to enums in your other classes, enum is basically a replacement for having to do something like this. So if you have something that you want different types to be, and you want a system like this, our default type is 1, another type is 2, and you want to avoid having to have this complicated network of things that you have to remember, use an enum instead. Enum allows you to designate them in simple terminology, so there are two kinds of requests here. There's a push user and a fetch. Since I've made it public, anybody can access this enum with all these different types. So these are kind of equivalent things here. The enum is just a convenient way to designate something where you have a lot of different types. We'll see how it's used in a bit, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. All right, I got a blank constructor here. Let's go on to the meat of it. Let's see, where should we start? It's quite long, and most of it's not that interesting. All right, let's start with, well, I've got my contact server. That's what's going to redirect the requests to be either fetches or pushes. So I take a request type as an argument. That goes back to the enum request type. You have to supply that as an argument. And then I take an array of parameters. Those are going to be what I'm actually going to send along to the PHP script. So I've made this generic so that you can send your parameters in any array, any size that you want, in case the PHP scripts take arrays of different sizes. But it does an error check to make sure you've supplied the right number of arguments. All right, so if the type is equal to requestType.fetch, there's the use of that enum there very simply to designate that this is a fetch type request by comparing against that enum. Then we're going to direct this to the fetch method, otherwise we're going to direct it to the push login method. And you'll notice that I'm taking a result as a string. And I said that it's used to store the result of the PHP script in the comment. This is actually all of that information that we are echoing back in our PHP script. So when connection echoes, connection established or connection failed, we are going to eventually pipe those back into results here in our Java code. So we're going to pipe back the echoes from the PHP statements into our Java code and print them out to the Java console here, or error reading type if the user didn't supply the right enum. All right, let's look at push login first. So this was the first PHP script we looked at too. First, the URL of it, we're taking that root URL, which I specified at the top, which is the directory with the PHP scripts in it. And then I'm adding the script name, and I added a dash. You can put the dash up here or here. It doesn't matter which way you want to do it. I prefer to put the dash here today. Whatever. So the name of the script, pushlogin.php in this case. Now we're going to get to the URL. Remember, all the information that is supplied to the PHP script is going to get encoded in the URL. Now, not in the part of the URL that we see, but in the HTTP post to the URL. What does URL stand for? Anybody know? Anyone remember what URL stands for? It's very tiny. You might be able to see it. What does URL stand for? Universal Resource Locator. So not designed to supply information, but here we are using it to actually pass information to a PHP script in order to get something back. So we are actually using something that is a locator to supply information. Now if you read the description here, it says a resource can be something as simple as a file or a directory, sure, or it can be a reference to a more complicated object, such as a query to a database. So that's exactly what we have here. We have a URL that is going to be structured as a query to a database. Actually, a query to a PHP script, which then queries a database. So we have a lot of layers. All right, we're extracting the three fields from the parameters from the array there, the user ID, the password, and the login time. I'm just doing that so that I can refer to them later on without having to refer to params. Obviously, if you had more items in your table you wanted to add, you just add them here. So this would be specific to the structure of your table. You can read my comments on your own later. All right, so now we need to establish an HTTP connection to that URL. And this is pretty straightforward. You have an example in your book too, and you've probably seen something already very similar with how we did our UDP and TCP connections. We're going to establish an HTTP connection object. I named mine very verbosely HTTP URL connection. Now we have to set the request type here. I've set it to post, but look at our other options, the things we learned about in our slides. We've got get, post, head, options, put, delete, and trace. We looked at almost all of these. I don't believe we looked at options or trace. Those are really rare. I don't think we looked at head either. But get and post are going to be your most common ones. We could have easily structured all of this as get again. In fact, you can go back, change all the PHP scripts to gets instead of posts, and change this to a get here, and you'll see that they still work, and you can note everything that's happening in the URL bar if you're interested in doing that. Okay, so we're setting the request to post, and then we want to specify this do output and do input. This is going to tell the URL connection whether we're just writing to it or we're also trying to get something back. So this is going to allow us to receive a response back on that HTTP URL connection. Now that we have the connection as with TCP and UDP, that's the part that exchanges the data. Now we actually need to get it, get the bytes out of it, get all the info out of it. So just like with TCP and UDP, we need an output stream to actually extract the data from the connection. So here we're doing a output stream. We use this for TCP and UDP as well. This is going to be to write the bytes, and then we're going to have one to read it later. So this output stream, and then obviously we'll have an input stream later. I'm using a buffered writer, which we also used a couple of times, and an output stream writer, which we also used a couple of times, just to write text. I'm only writing text here, basically, so I don't need to write raw bytes into a URL. I'm writing strings. When we wrote strings in the past for like the earlier homeworks, I think 3 and 4, we also used a buffered writer. Feel free to interrupt me with any questions if I'm going too fast here, by the way. Most of this stuff is boilerplate, and it takes a very long time to do. You don't have to understand it fully, but the idea that we're encoding everything into a URL here is going to be important. All right, now for the important magic here. We're going to be crafting that post data into a URL. So I'm building the URL by encoding these different strings. So these are the column names in the table where I want to insert. So I've got user ID, password, and last login. Remember, our PHP script is going to be looking for those. Well, let's go back to it. This is push login. Our PHP script is looking for those. It's looking for them here. It wants them in the post message. It wants 3 fields named user ID, password, and last login. So we are going to give those in Java double quotes, string literals, user ID, password, login. And then remember I said that the URL is going to look like that, and then a bunch of equal signs. Okay, so we're getting an equal sign, and then we're getting the user ID that was supposed to be transmitted. So this is the user ID you actually want to send, which you specified in the params, in the array of strings that you passed to this method. Okay, so we've sent the user ID, then the password, and then the last login. I make sure everything is encoded as UTF-8 because that is what our database and the tables in it expect. Remember, I set everything to UTF-8 general CI encoding, which is going to be the same, I believe, as what Java considers to be UTF-8 by default. I'm going to print out attempting to push, and I'm going to print the post data to the console so we can make sure everything's hunky-dory, and then we write it to the buffered writer. Flush in order to do the transmit, just like we had to do for UDP. You have to do a flush before it will actually send. So you have to flush the buffer before it will actually send. And then I close everything, and we're done. I've sent it over the HTTP connection. Now I want to get the information back, the response back. So I'm going to open up an input stream in order to get the response back. Again, it's going to be an input stream connected to the URL connection. I could have opened them all up here together. I wanted to separate the output from the input for you guys. Again, I'm going to have a buffered reader because I'm reading strings. That's my preferred way to do it. It's quicker. And at this point, I have already loaded the data in. Don't worry too much about the encoding that I ended up using. It just happened to work out here. I think probably UTF-8 would work here as well. Just don't worry about it. That's the encoding that printed something to console, so I'm going to roll with it. And I have loaded my information in from the input stream at this point, and now I'm going to read all of the lines that came in on that input stream on that buffered reader. So while there are more lines to read, we've seen this before, while line equals buffer read line is not equal to null, so there are more lines to read. Load them into line, and I'm going to save those lines into the result, and then close everything, disconnect, etc. And this method returns the result. If something goes wrong along this whole process, I put everything in a try-catch, just put a couple of error messages in there. You'll get return method or PHP error if something goes wrong. Hopefully that doesn't happen. And that all returns as a string. That returns to the contact server message here, and then it returns that string as well. So this should have added a row to the database and then returned that confirmation for you that's successfully added, etc. All right, so in the driver, I'm going to comment out everything up to there for now. So I'm just leaving the print result at the end. All right, and let me uncomment just the changed the name, didn't I? Yep, let me uncomment just the part where I send the push. All right, so this starts a new PHP communicator and sends it. I'm going to change it to, let's go with test user, something secure, and then I'm still going to send the time in milliseconds there. I've converted it to a string because our database is expecting everything in UTF-8 string format. So we're not expecting longs, we're expecting strings. It is a control slash to comment out. Someone asked. It's control slash. Some people prefer to do this whole thing here with the slash star on both ends. I'm more of a fan of control slash. Easier to comment and uncomment out big blocks that way. All right, so let's run it and see what happens. Now, when you run it, you'll note it takes a bit, okay? It's not instant. HTTP is slow. PHP is slow. It's not very slow. It's not like we're not getting anything, but it's relatively slow. So note here again what the URL looks like if you were to see it. User ID equals test user and password equals something secure, and that's like this is what the URL would look like if this was a get instead of a post. And note that after maybe a quarter second or so, you get connection established, adding the table, inserted successfully. If we go back to our database here and refresh the page, we should see that our new test user got added. There they are. Notice their table ID is 7 because I deleted 5 and 6. So table ID is always going to be unique because it's auto-incrementing. Notice their password here appears as text. So remember, for your homework, you have to save it as the SHA-256 of their password as hex. And I expect you to do the same thing this time. So since that is a text, you printed it out as text before, right, to the screen, you're going to do the same thing here. You're going to store it in the password field as text. This gives you pretty much everything you need for the homework, these 3 methods that I've included here. In addition to push, you've also got fetch. Fetch takes parameters, first the name of the column, then the key you want to search for. So first the name user ID, then it's going to ask for the key you want to search for, so that actual user's name, then the name of the first column, then the name of the second column that you want to return. So in this implementation, in my driver, I have asked it to return, and this is a very long inquiry here, I have asked it to return the user ID column that contains the name fish, and I've asked it to return the data for the password and the last login column for me. So it's going to look for the user ID column, find the user named fish, and return the information in their password and last login column. That's what that PHP script that it's communicating with echoes back, if you'll recall. And then the rest of this is me extracting the data, because when we run this, remember, I'll run it again here, it's actually going to print out the result here, which is including the text connection established, the name, and then everything else that it echoes back. It also has the word data in there. So I have just done a little bit of string manipulation to extract everything that follows after the data, and then printed it out. Alright, and then I added one more script for your convenience for the homework. I added that does user exist, and also the corresponding JavaScript here as well. Again, it's almost exactly the same, except the post data in the URL encoder is different. So all three of these methods are the same, except basically for the post data that they send, which means they probably should have a little bit less duplication, but I was lazy. The only difference is that the doesUserExist method is a Boolean, and rather than returning the output of the PHP script, it evaluates it on its own down here by just checking if it contains the word found, which is a cheesy but simple way to do it, and if so, it returns true, and if not, it returns false. Alright, that's it. If you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, hopefully you have everything that you need for the homework assignment. Next time we'll play with our server to add some more features to it. Hopefully DNS. Again, let me know if you have a cheaper, well, actually it's gonna have to let me know if you have a free DNS provider that you think isn't terrible. Otherwise I'll just look into a few on my own. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll see you on Wednesday.